All right, my name is John Baur. I'm an employee here at Oasis Digital. I've been working here a couple years now and been using Angular most of that time. Today I want to talk a little bit about the new controller as feature. I say new, it was introduced around 1.2, but it's still not being used a lot. And then spend a lot of time, or most of the time, talking about how to manage messy, complex controllers. So when you first learn about Angular, one of the first things you're taught is about controllers and how to use this scope. So you're taught, you give your module a controller and you inject the scope into that controller. Then you can put properties on the scope and somehow mysteriously they're available over here in your HTML. So there's a lot of magic behind it. So I pulled up the wrong thing, but there you see my message is put up there. So this works great and all, but there is a lot of mystery behind it. Why do I have to put a scope on every controller I create? If I'm an outside developer who doesn't know a whole lot about Angular and I come and look at your code, I see that you're using a message, but it's not really clear where that comes from unless I know about this scope over here. So there's a new way to do it using controller as now, which is, it's starting to become the preferred method around people who use Angular. So the controller is really just a JavaScript class, so we can kind of use it as one. And instead of it injecting scope here, I'm just going to use this object. So now set this.message equals hello world. Let me change it just so we know we're getting updated. So over here in my HTML, instead of just referring to main controller, now we're going to we're going to create an instance of this controller. I'm going to give it a variable name, just main controller as main. So now I can bind to main.message. Save. It didn't work. I knew that was going to happen as soon as I tried this live. Oh, because I didn't save my controller. Minor technical hiccup. Okay, so it did work. I just didn't save everything. So I think this is a lot better. For one, there's no confusion on where this message came from. Message is a property of main, which is an instance of this main controller. If I go look in my code, I can see where it came from. The other thing, and this is taught in a lot of Angular tutorials, is the dot rule. So if you start nesting controllers, and if I put a new div under here, normally you wouldn't know, is this message supposed to refer to the second controller, to the main controller? Is it ambiguous? But using this, you would say second control as sec. And now you can easily read through the HTML and know exactly where that message is coming from. So that's the quick and dirty. One more thing I forgot. You're not automatically injecting scope into a controller just because you're creating a controller. You're only injecting scope when you need it. So you can still use watch or broadcast, things like that, and then you can inject your scope. But it becomes more of a dependency when you need it, like everything else. It's not just a given, oh, I'm creating a controller, I have to give it a scope. So for those reasons, I think it's a lot cleaner to use. We've shifted to this in our projects, and I would encourage doing the same. Does anybody have any questions about this before we move on with it?
So in a case where you do need to do something with the scope, you go ahead and inject it, and then you assign all the properties to scope instead of this dot? Or?
No, I would still inject scope. But let's say I need to watch something. I believe you just do a scope.watch. And here's where you would normally do, say, message, and give it some sort of function. Obviously, it's not going to find message because it's looking on the scope. So instead of that, you give it a function
So that's where it kind of goes in the opposite direction. Now, this specific part of it is much uglier.
This is a lot uglier. If we go into depth about this, you probably wouldn't use watches as much. You do more in the services and trying to think of it. You try not to you don't throw as many watches in there just because you can. You're going to do more with services and not necessarily watching the service, but
You still can use string for the first argument for watch, but it has to be main.message, which then
you can do that?
couples the contents of your controller to how things are defined in the partial, which are the HTML, which may or may not be good. But yeah, that will work.
That will work? Okay. See, and that's where I think it starts getting a little messier because it's not, because main is actually declared out here,
Yeah.
yet you're referring to it in here, and that would get even messier. That could be a talk for another day, going into how to use scope in addition to this, or in combination with this. But I think it also encourages you to use watch less, which is a better way to use Angular as well. All right, so now I'll kind of go on to the meat of the talk. So this is just a small sample project I wrote up. Let's say you're given the task to write a small application which just retrieves a list of projects. When I click on a project, I want it to give a name and description. That's simple enough to do in Angular. Here's my app controller. Let me pull up in my HTML. So the HTML gets kind of long just because I've thrown a lot of bootstrap stuff in there, but really the meat of it isn't that big. The Angular controller, we've got 35 lines. That's not a big deal. Let's say, it never stops there. Then somebody comes and says, well, this is a great screen, but we'd also like a little bit more functionality there. So we want to be able to add and remove people from this project. So again, not a big change. It's reasonable that somebody would ask for that on the same page. But now your controller is 55 lines long, and your HTML gets even larger. 55 lines, not that big for a JavaScript file, but when you're talking about a single controller, it's starting to get a little unwieldy. And especially since we've only added 2 real features here, you can imagine a lot more being added. And as you keep adding more panels here, the controller grows more and more out of hand. This is really a misuse of the controller. What controllers are made to do is to control a single view. And when we kind of look at the screen, I mean, this is one layer of functionality, this is a separate piece of functionality, and this is a separate piece. So really, it's preferable if we give each their own controller. But we started with a small app, started throwing controllers in it, and now we need to start dividing that up. So the first thing I want to do is start dividing this HTML up a little bit. So I've got everything in one HTML file, but I'm going to have 3 pieces of code. I'd like to work on each one of them separately in the HTML. So I'm going to grab can't find it here, the panel that does the details. I'm going to strip it out into a separate file. The panel that does the people assignment, I'll strip that out into a different file. I've already done this in a different step of my branch here, so we don't have to watch it all. But if you look now, I haven't done anything with the JavaScript code yet. just made these two lines down here, an ng include that's going to pull in HTML from a different template. If I pull that up, everything still works the same. It's just grabbing the HTML, putting it straight in there, using the same controller, nothing's changed yet. So obviously what I need to do now is start splitting these controllers up. So the first thing I'm going to do is pull up one of these templates. And I've already said I want to give this template its own controller. This is a detail, so I'm just going to call this project detail controller as PDC. Now this is still working because it's a child of our parent controller, but we don't want it to be a child, or we don't want it to depend on the parent. Sorry. So I want to be able to inject this controller somewhere else. Maybe I want to strip this into a directive later. So anywhere I'm referring to PLC, I don't want to do that anymore. This is the first step to stripping everything out, is to find out where I'm still referring to that parent controller and start peeling it into its own controller. So I can see that I'm going to need access to the project, and I'm going to need this save project function. Sorry, I get a little confused sometimes when I got tabs on the top and bottom and I want to switch between each. So I can't just take project out of the controller and put it in the other, because right now project list controller is the only one that knows about my project. So the way I need something to share which project is selected between all my controllers. I'm going to do that with a service. I think I've decided that live coding this is going to be a lot tougher than I thought it was going to be. So I'm just going to switch to the next branch and show you what I've done. So I created this new service called a project service. And this is where I'm now storing my project. So back on my project list controller, before I had a get project, I have a get project function that what it did was set project to a certain project. Let me just a second, one second. Let me go back. I should have explained this first. So get project is a function on the main list. So when I click on a project, I've got two lines here. Normally it would go out and do a server call, but I don't have a server set up, so I'm just passing it the project and setting that to the project on the form, which all the controllers can access. But once I start splitting up the services, I can't do that anymore. So that's where I've moved it down into the service. So I'm doing the exact same thing, but I'm doing it in a service. And now I have a simple getter function for this project that returns whatever we've selected. So I can set get project to the function, and then this .project is now a reference to this getter function. Back on my HTML, instead of referencing project ID, project is now a function, so I just do a function call and say, go out to the service, get the project, bring it back, and show it on the screen. I've done the same thing in my project detail. Oh, I haven't done that yet, sorry. I just want to prove that I peeled all this stuff into a service and my main controller still works. So we can see that I've wired this up. This is still part of the list controller, as is this header up here. And I can see that it's working, I just haven't wired up these two controllers yet. The other thing I've done, I've just moved another. There was an add project, you can see here, so I can add a new one. And we've also moved that to the service. So the next thing to do is start wiring up this detail screen. So I created this new project detail controller set on here, which matches this ng controller on my details HTML. This is very simple because all it's handling is up the top a name and description, and a little save button. So that's kind of what we went through before. I went through each of these and figured out that I need a project and I need to save projects. Well, the same way I was referencing the project as a function call, I did that here too. So this .project is a reference to the selected project function on the service, and save project is just a reference to the save on the service. So I moved this save function from the list controller to the service so any controller can use it. And now we can see that details and description work just as well as they did before. So really, once you start peeling things out like that, it becomes really simple to do the next step. We're going to do the exact same thing for the people controller. I'm going to try coding this one just so you can see how it works. So I'm going to make a controller called project people control. I know I'm going to need to inject this project service into it because we're sharing the project across controllers. So if I pull up my people, I see I'm going to need this add person function. I'm going to need a list of available people. I need access to the project, obviously, and I need this remove person function. So that's where I need to go into my app and start peeling those things out. First thing we're going to do, I didn't really go over this. If anybody doesn't understand why we do var that equals this, that's so when we start going into, let me find an example, in here. When I'm inside a function that I'm assigned to this, inside here, if I'm referring to this.project list, it gets a little foggy on what this actually refers to. Does it refer to the controller? I think in this instance it would actually refer to the function. So I use that variable, so I know I'm talking about this as it applies to the controller. So anyway, I've set up the people control, I've set up project so it references the project on the service. I know I need this. The list of people isn't needed on the list, so I can just cut that out. It's only going to be needed in this controller. I can throw it in here. Same with the add and remove person. I mean, this is a very simple example, but it really doesn't get much harder than this when you're dividing up controllers. Obviously, I only need to add a person and remove a person within the context of this people controller, so I can move them right in here. Now, is there anything else that I missed? So if I go back to here, I need to use the controller. And then, given these different names, it's not only more idiomatic, but I can see that I don't want to use PLC anywhere, so if I have any instances of PLC, that's something I need to change. So I've moved available people to my new controller. I moved add person. Project is now a function that gets the project from the service. And let's see if this works.
You need to save on the other buffer.
Probably. Thank you. Oh, HTTP is not defined because, and I would have run into this if I saw it on the last one. Since I moved in HTTP, oh no, wait.
Move to the other controller.
Yeah, on line 31.
Oh, there is an HTTP here. So I need to inject HTTP into this controller. Now I can, it's all wired back up. So the good part of this, let me pull up my most recent branch because I know that has all the code that I want. Oops. I know this is completed. So the best part of this is now when I look at this, it's very easy to manage. I have a small project list controller. It's about 18 lines long. My project detail, there's not much to it. I've only got 2 lines here. If I need to add anything to this screen, which it's very likely they're going to want more than this, but it's divided up nice and neat. Same with the people controller. We've got about 20 lines there. My service isn't that long either, but really I would like to take this service a bit farther. And so right now I'm using this to do everything that's shared between the controllers, as well as all the server calls are in here too. Really, I'd like a service, one service that its only purpose is to communicate between the controllers. Then I have another service that's responsible for communicating with the server. Just doing things like that, giving each thing its own responsibility, just makes it easier to add to and easier to manage in the future.
So once you've gone to the work of splitting things up in this way, how do you feel about moving them to actually separate source files?
That's another thing that it really just depends on how, I think it depends on how much you have in here. Right now this is, a 73 line file. It's not that big of a deal to manage. But yeah, once this gets bigger, I would definitely consider moving them into different source files as well. And in addition, I don't like having HTTP calls in my controllers. A controller should really be code related to your view, and it should only know things about the view. It shouldn't care about communicating with the server. So, like I said before, I would peel this off into a different service, so this would get even smaller. I feel like I went through a lot of that pretty fast. Does it make sense? Are there more questions about it? Obviously, like I said before, this is a small project, or a very small application. So it was pretty easy to go through. But you can see if I had 7 or 8 views on the screen, how that could have been a beast to tackle. So the right way to do it is to start out by writing it this way. And each time you say, hey, this functionality really isn't tied to showing you a list, just start with a new controller. More discussions or questions on this?
About the var that equals this,
Mm-hmm.
a nice side effect of using arrow functions is that for the most part the need for that goes away. So if you look, for example, at line 30 up there, where you have to use that, there's no way around it. But if you were using arrow functions for the anonymous function you pass in on 29, then you wouldn't have to, because it doesn't introduce any value for this. It's a nice benefit of looking at those.
Yeah, that's something I'll have to try out.
Yeah, I gotta say that's one thing I don't particularly like about this way is having to have that.
And so we noticed when we started doing it this way that we have been able to dodge, like just sort of writing the $1 scope style, we almost never hit having to tinker with the JavaScript this oddity. But with this controller as approach, sort of all the luminaries say you should be using, it is right in your face all the time unless you pick up ES6. It's sort of like upgrading one thing, now I really want to upgrade the other thing so I can get back the conciseness I had.
Okay. Well,
Do you know how's your total line count compare?
um,
Because one thing I noticed is like as you tore them apart, you had to kind of add a line of code here and there to wire them back together. And so for
Right.
this chunk of functionality, it'd be really interesting to compare the total line count before and
for
after.
this one, I think we actually added about 20 lines of code.
About 20 lines, and out of how many
Out of-
lines before and after?
Out of 50 or so, went to about 70 or so.
40%,
But
about 40% increase to wire them back up. Yeah.
it is, but that's only for this size. I don't think
Yeah.
that's going to maintain
I think
40%.
if each chunk was bigger, the wiring wouldn't necessarily get any bigger.
Right. I mean, you're still going to do a couple lines of code for each wiring up.
So it might only cost 20% code size on a more realistic,
Right.
complex project.
Right. But when
You
you're
feel like it's
talking
worth it?
about, you know,
Do you feel like it's worth it? Because I'm never sure if it's worth it. Every time I change code, I'm never sure if I like it better than the way
I
the
do
old way.
just because of the modularity and what I talked about. I think even if it's a 20% increase, maintaining 1,000 lines of code in one controller or 1,200 lines
Yeah.
of code
I gotcha.
split up into pieces,
Yeah. It's worth it.
it's worth it.
You
So,
want to keep recording what?
I guess the thing too is if you add more controllers on top of this that use that one service, then like the code is gonna,
right.
the 20 lines now might be much bigger over 3 controllers, I think,
Right.
versus 20 or something.
So that was my presentation, and now I think we wanted to open it up for more just a kind of regular roundtable.